Of all the countries to have ever graced the Eurovision stage, I must say Moldova really does hold a very special place in my heart. They may not be especially large or rich, but since their debut, they've been doing their best non-stop to try and leave an impression. And I'm also sure they're the only country where it would be both accurate and complimentary to summarise their approach with this single gif. I salute you, Moldova, you proud little Twilight Zone you. May your bones be ever rich with calcium. Hello everyone, I am Tessellating Hexagons, and okay, I admit it, that was a really weird way of introducing a country, but I mean it in the nicest possible way. Moldova is, for the most part, bonkers and proud of it, so of course I had to make a video about their Eurovision tendencies. In fact, back when they still took part in the Junior Eurovision, I held something of a tongue-in-cheek little theory that, unlike the rest of the world, Moldovan people start life relatively sensible and then develop a wild imagination as they get older, as opposed to everyone else being born crazy and getting more and more boring as they grow up, that is. But before my analogy gets too hard to follow and starts offending people, let's take a quick look at the fast facts about Moldova. First up, their national broadcaster is TRM, or Teleradio Moldova for long, and there's some creativity right there, I suppose, right out of the gate. Most countries' national broadcasters have their country of origin first in the name, you know, Sveriges Television, the British broadcasting company, you know, like that. But then Moldova and Romania, and Spain, I think, all put it at the end of the name, so, you know, being a bit different. Good for you. But I admit that is a deliberately protracted example of what I'm going to be getting at later in this video, so I'll just leave that there. Their present head of delegation, as far as I can tell, is Vitalie Kojakaru. I can't guarantee that they haven't found a replacement since then, I don't see why they would need to, but I know at the very least that Vitalie was the head of delegation in 2013, so that's the fact that I'm running with, and I've not seen any evidence to the contrary just yet. And the country made their debut in the 2005 contest in Kiev with the band Zdobshi Stub, and an enviable 6th place finish that they earned with a delightfully mad Bunica Batetoba, which the internet can't seem to agree on how to spell, so I'm just going with the one they use on Wikipedia. And in fact, this was their best placing that they would ever achieve in the contest, never again placing in the single digits in the top 9. Until the most recent contest as of the recording of this video. Yes indeed, once again in Kiev, plucky little Moldova rocketed to the top of the scoreboard, or not too far off it at least, in 2017, with Sunstroke Project and Hey Mama, finishing in 3rd place overall and joining forces with Bulgaria and Portugal to demonstrate to Europe and the world that you don't need to be a huge, rich, powerful Eurovision juggernaut country to do well. I'd like to think they've inspired a whole generation of Eurovision fans with that. Failing that, the group did at least receive one of their country's highest honours upon their return home after the contest, and rightly so. But once you get past their 3 top 10 finishes out of 13 attempts, I really wouldn't blame you for asking, so what? Where are you going with this, Tess? And I hear you, I don't know why you sound like a poor imitation of Winston Churchill, but hey, just run with it. So Moldova's habits are a bit off-piste compared to most countries at the contest. Surely there's only so much one can say about that, right? Well, yes, I will concede that I can't very well do a 20-ish minute video just focusing on Moldova's weird side, but in absolute fairness, just doing that would be doing Moldova a huge disservice. Just because they favour more colourful entries on the whole doesn't mean that they're not capable of having a serious side, and then there's also the question of their results. I make it sound like they never do well, with those 3 top 10 finishes as the magical exceptions, but in truth, on average, Moldova is a mainstay of the top 15 of the Eurovision final. That's not to say they're infallible, of course. It's impossible to deny that they did go through a bit of a grey period of non-qualification in the mid-2010s, and at the time of recording this video, I'll freely admit, even highlight, it is too early to say whether Sunstroke Project's 3rd place showstopper is the start of a new era, or just a fluke breaking up a losing streak. We don't know yet. Well, perhaps we should make that something of a focus for this video then. Let's take a look at Moldova's favourite flavours and see if we can't predict the near future for them. Is their brand of unabashed wacky back in fashion? Or was 2017 just a lucky strike thanks to a famous face in the form of the mimetic legend that is Sergei Stepanov, aka the epic sax guy? Will they be so lucky in the near future, or has their popularity all but run away? Okay, I'll stop. I think the most pertinent way to start this analysis is to look at Moldova's 13 entries to date, and, for the purposes of this thought experiment, categorise them into 2 groups: sensible and fun. And with that in place, we can spend a good amount of time focusing on each group individually, and then step back and look at the bigger picture once all the pieces are in place. Now, note that I use the word fun here, as opposed to lapsing back into calling the quirkier songs weird. For some people, that label might carry some unintended connotations, and referring to these songs as fun broadens up the scale a bit, so I can include, for instance, 2009, without it sounding like I'm insulting Moldova's traditional culture, which absolutely isn't my intention. It's fun, and it might be strange to people who aren't familiar with it, but it is still their culture. They are more than just funny foreigners, this is their tradition to them. So, fun, not weird. Okay? Okay. So, let's begin. Looking just at the fun category, one pattern should make itself obvious right out of the gate. Though this is a semi-arbitrary label that I'm choosing to apply at my own discretion, every single one of these entries that could be considered less than serious have all successfully qualified. The obsessive statistician in me is also somewhat tickled that, chronologically, these 6 qualifiers came 2nd, 5th, 10th, 10th, 5th and 2nd in that order in their respective semi-finals, and 2 and 5 are the only prime factors of 10. Wait a minute, I haven't studied maths since high school. Who cares about the properties of these numbers? The first thing that I'd like to draw attention to is this pattern, especially contrasted with the fact that 4 of the 7 songs in the sensible category failed to qualify outright, and how it seems to fly in the face of the theory that I put forward across the 2 most recent Eurovision-flavoured Patreon videos as a whole, in which I shared my grand united theory for winning Eurovision, and how novelty songs don't categorically fare as well. This seems to be direct evidence to the contrary. However, I am me. Did you really think I'd draw attention to this without having a rebuttal prepared? The fundamental difference between Moldova's fun songs and your average novelty Eurovision entry is that Moldova's across the board are submitted and performed with heart. Admittedly, that does sound a bit airy-fairy, so I'll elaborate. Say what you will about Zdobshi Stub, or Pasha Parfany's entry, or the others, but you can't tell me that even one of those songs was performed with an air of not caring about the contest or how it reflects on them as artists. Let's take an extreme example and compare the approach to Ireland in 2008. Dust in the Turkey's entry was very much a self-aware self-parody, with the intent of trying to garner points by pandering to the lowest common denominator's sense of humour in its country of origin. And as a reviewer from the UK, trust me, I know plenty about that. Every facet of the composition and delivery reeked of, "Laugh at us, we don't care that it makes us look ignorant," and that's a terrible way of approaching Eurovision. It demeans the viewer, and it insults the integrity of the competition as a whole. Conversely, even Moldova's strangest songs retain aspects of self-respect. Zdobshi Stub perform in their signature style, which isn't intended to mock or belittle anything. Lauta delivered a light-hearted narrative in a sincere style, just with a quirky atmosphere. Hora din Moldova was a popified traditional Moldovan hora, delivered sincerely but in an accessible way, designed to highlight the fun elements of it without making it silly. I could go on. The point is, Moldova's fun songs are never written expressly to be laughed at as their primary goal, and that in itself is worthy of admiration, no questions asked. Now, because their intention isn't to parody themselves or otherwise play the role of the clown, this enables the performers to maximize their sincerity and constitution and deliver the song with the kind of energy that encourages the audience to sympathize with them and enjoy the song on an equal level, as opposed to encouraging the audience to look down on the song and mock it and try to make them feel better than the song. After all, if you view a song as being on your level, you're more inclined to vote for it. If it kowtows and intends to present itself as being beneath you for your entertainment, if it presents itself as being too lowbrow for you, then you're more inclined to just laugh at it and then forget about it a minute later and move on to whatever next catches your interest by more legitimate means. Joke entries do the latter, Moldovan entries do the former. Now, having laid that groundwork, let's remind ourselves that not all Moldovan entries work that way. In fact, more than half of their entries to date fall into the sensible category, and more than half of those fail to qualify. So let's dig a little here and see what comes up. The problem that the sensible songs present to what I've been saying so far is, by default, any Eurovision entry that does not have a super light-hearted atmosphere is, or so you would assume, liable to being performed with sincerity and gusto, to the extent that I was talking about before, you know, by default, as a base level. So you'd assume that any serious song would automatically qualify on the grounds of being delivered with heart, like I was saying before. Well, in truth, depending on the flavour of the song, those rules don't necessarily apply. See, with the light-hearted songs, a focused and well-meaning delivery makes all the difference for the reasons I outlined before. but with more serious songs, you're operating on almost a completely different playing field. Instead of appealing to the audience's positive and whimsical emotions, you're trying to play towards the audience's darker side, or at least their more grounded, more serious, potentially more realist, as in realism, kind of side. And to appeal in that way requires a totally different set of skills. It feels like I'm talking in circles just a little bit here, and in rather broad strokes at that. So let's take a couple of case studies and go a bit deeper. First of all, let's think about Aliona Moon and Omie in 2013, which is a very rare example of a song starting life as an English language national finalist and then being translated into the country in question's native language for the contest. Usually it's the other way around, but I digress. Omie was a sweeping, stormy ballad filled with intense emotion that transcended the language barrier, whilst also showing swelling pride in the language in question by way of the decision to translate it. Aliona performed it with conviction, made the necessary connection to the audience, and finished 11th out of 26 in the final after qualifying in 4th place. This worked because the song was delivered with straight-faced, unwavering, unquestionable confidence that sweeps the average viewer up into its tumult of emotions and encourages them to sympathize. Even if you don't understand the words, you still understand the feeling the song intends to convey, and it all sounds very genuine. Conversely, the following year, Christina Scarlett's Wild Soul achieved what is, to date, Moldova's statistical lowest placing in the contest. In its semi-final of 16, it placed last, though Lydia Izak would go on to finish 17th in a field of 18 2 years later, so the lines are kind of blurry there, but stick with me. On the surface, this might seem like a jarring shift in how a song of the same genre would be received by roughly the same audience, with not much variable in place other than the time of the performance. In reality, Wild Soul was presented in a much more over-the-top way. It included a rare-spotted downwards key change towards the end, and the staging incorporated not only stereotypical Eurovision male eye candy, but also the rather dramatic move of Christina quite viscerally tearing her hair out, even if it was just a hairpiece installed for exactly that effect. In no uncertain terms, it presented itself as part of a form of sensory overload, which made it difficult to take seriously in spite of its very serious intentions, especially compared to Moldova's intentionally light-hearted entries. This idea of staging and presentation that invites the audience to take the song less seriously than if they'd heard it in a vacuum continued for the next 2 years, with Eduard Romaniuta's helipad-centric parkour to underscore his decidedly Britney Spears-esque pop number. I mean, I liked it, but whatever. And Lydia Izak danced with a fully dressed astronaut, so fully dressed in fact that the dancer still had their backstage pass lanyard on during the performance. Awkward? Now, it is worth interjecting here to say 2 things. One, I actually really like all of Moldova's songs, with the possible exception of 2006, which I'm lukewarm towards. I don't want them to be mocked or derided or whatever. And B, it would be positively foolish to assume that the aforementioned entries didn't fare well just exclusively for the reasons I mentioned. It's not as if different staging would have radically changed history here. However, in these 3 cases, the staging fed directly into the atmosphere of, I suppose they were mixed signals regarding how the song should be interpreted by the audience, and that indecision that they evoke in the audience is ultimately what cost each entry points in the grand scheme of things. After all, why waste energy trying to decide whether or not to vote for a song that wavers on the border when another song can come along and quite convincingly state, here's what I'm about, I'm good, vote for me, without any of the ambiguity? What I mean to say is their entries from 2014 to 2016 wanted to be taken seriously, but for various reasons didn't come across in a way that was conducive to engendering that. Clear? Good. Let's move on. Now, there is one elephant in the room that I ought to address before I close off my analysis that might throw something of a wrench into the relative clear-cutness of what I've said thus far. Put quite simply, how can we be certain that what I've said is the absolute, unfiltered truth, and that the presence of some familiar faces isn't a factor in any way? Well, before I get too carried away with my choice of words there, it is worth mentioning that being a returning artist in Eurovision is an absolute crapshoot as to whether or not you get a good result for it. I mean, without crunching the actual numbers off the top of my head, it seems pretty 50-50. I mean, Bulgaria, for instance. Elitsa and Stoyan pulled a double shift and went from 5th in the final to 12th in the semis, but so did Polygonova. She went from 12th in the semis to 4th in the final. And you see this repeated throughout Eurovision history. Valentina Moneta in both directions. Helena Paparizou for better between 2001 and 2005. Lena and Ira Losko for worse, albeit not by much. the pattern goes on. So how does Moldova fit into this? The bluntest truth is, they fit the pattern in every conceivable way. Stobje Stub placed 6th in the final of 2005, then returned 6 years later and finished 12th. Interestingly, both Pasha Partheny and Aliona Moon finished 11th in the final, which might seem arbitrary until you realise that Aliona was one of Pasha's delightfully strange backing dancers, and Pasha was Aliona's composer and pianist in return. And then there's Sunstroke Project, who went from 22nd in 2010 to a heroic 3rd place finish in 2017. But that's where the question arises. What caused them specifically to do so well? The possibilities are as follows. 1. They simply had a compelling song that met the needs of the European and Australian zeitgeist of 2017. I'm 90% on board with that explanation personally. 2. They were so well received because people recognised them from 2010. I don't really believe that in isolation, mostly because 3. They were well received because people recognised Sergei Stepanov from the Epic Sax Guy meme. Now let's be clear, I don't want to discredit Hey Mama in any way by implying that its success was solely down to the meme-centric brand recognition, because I don't think that was the main reason at all. I think it drew some attention, yes, but not enough to be the sole contributing cause to it placing 3rd overall. But it is worth observing here, when Moldova sends returning artists, whether they improve on their previous placing or not, they at least reach the final regardless of the flavour of song. But is that a hard and fast rule for all eternity? I would say no. Eurovision is much more dynamic than that. It really isn't. You can't just say, oh, I'll send this artist twice and they'll automatically do well. That's simply not how it works. But it is still food for thought. Now, that being the case, what grade can I award Moldova based on what I've seen and what we can expect of them? A lot of my brain is urging me to award them a rank B, but one nagging feeling is staying my hand a little with that. I don't do pluses and minuses and other Americanisms on my personal ranking system, so I will have to round it to a C. But rest quite assured, that would be a C+, or actually a B-, because Moldova is this close to being in like B rank tier. They're that close. The only thing that gives me cause to hesitate are their grey period from 2014 to 2016, the fact that when they do qualify, they usually tend to end up upper mid-table most of the time on average, and then also that lingering doubt that some of Hey Mama's popularity was down to the Epic Sax Guy, whether it still would have reached 3rd place even without the internet's culture to boost it. I would like to think that it did earn its place legitimately, but for some people it is still a question. Still, whether or not that's the case, I can conclude this much at least. I am firmly confident that Sunstroke Project have, by way of their compelling result alongside Bulgaria's and Portugal's in 2017, given Moldova, and many other small countries besides, the confidence they need to pour more resources into their Eurovision approach, and you know what I believe about doing that. The more you put in, the more you get out. So, could we see a new golden age for Moldovan creativity in the near future? I would say it is more than plausible. I hope you don't let me down there, Moldova. And on that most spiriting of notes, I should bid you a fond farewell for now. Thank you so much for watching, as always, and thank you even more besides if you do happen to support me on patreon.com/TessHex. I wouldn't plug this at the end of these videos if I didn't have a good reason. The lovely people on Patreon are the reason I make these videos at all, so if you enjoy these videos, either be grateful to them or join them or both. Maybe. They keep me going, and in return, I supply them with all manner of perks to make it worth their while. Give it a look, it is worth it, I promise. No matter what you pledge, you get to see these videos a month in advance. That's got to count for something, right? With that being said though, it now just falls to me to say that I have been, and will continue to be, Tessellating Hexagons, and I thank you very much for your time. I'll see you when next you choose to see me. Bye for now.